I've been a nurse at Willowbrook Elderly Care Home for a few years now, and let me tell you, it's not what you'd expect. Sure, there are challenges, and some residents can be difficult, but most of them, sweethearts. All it takes is a little compassion and patience to break through to them. I genuinely love my job, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But there's one part of the job that I dreaded: the confessions. As people near the end of their lives, they often feel the need to unburden themselves, to share their deepest, darkest secrets with someone. And more often than not, that someone is one of us nurses. I've heard it all: affairs, thefts, even a few crimes that would make your hair stand on end. But nothing could have prepared me for what I heard from Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson was a bitter old man who'd been at Willowbrook longer than I had. The other nurses warned me about him from day one. God help you if you have to deal with him, they said. He can ruin your entire week just by opening his mouth. I didn't take them seriously at first. I thought, how bad could he be? Spoiler alert, he was worse. Our first interaction was memorable, to say the least. It was a quiet evening, and I had to check on him to make sure he took his medicine. I found him in his room, lounging in his recliner, facing the window with his back to the door. He didn't even bother to turn around when I entered. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," I greeted him cheerfully. "Hey, fresh meat," he spat back, his voice dripping with spite. I gritted my teeth and tried to sound polite. "My name is Emily, but you can call me." "Fresh meat," he interrupted. "You won't last a month, so I won't bother learning your name." He pointed at the empty pill bottle on the nightstand next to him. Without another word, I took my leave, feeling a mix of anger and determination. I wasn't about to let some cranky old man with a vendetta against happiness get the better of me. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. I'd go to his room for this or that, he'd make some snide remark to insult me, and I'd hold my tongue. But one evening, as I entered his room to change his bedding, something changed. "You still there?" he called out. I paused, taken aback. "Yes, Mr. Thompson? Do you need something?" "My God, woman, you're about as smart as you are pretty," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That was it. Something inside me snapped. I threw the fresh sheets haphazardly on the bed and stomped over to his recliner. "Listen here, you shriveled up old prune," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I don't know what your problem is, but I don't deserve this kind of treatment. I'm not surprised your family left you here with an attitude like that. If I had the choice, I'd drop you off at the nearest dumpster and be done with it." I hurled insult after insult at him, digging deep to dredge out the nasty side of me. I fully expected him to go off on me, to return the favor with even more venom. But instead, he just sat there and took it all. A satisfied grin spreading across his face with each word I spat out. When I finally ran out of breath, he waited a moment to make sure I was done. Then he said, "What did you say your name was again?" "Emily," I replied, still fuming. "Emily," he repeated, letting each letter roll off his tongue. "Tell you what, I like you, and that was that." He returned to staring out the window, and I was left standing there, bewildered and breathless. Our interactions changed after that. He still gave me lip, but it was different, more playful, less cruel. I could work with that. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. What started as a bitter old man's attitude problem would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister. Looking back now, I wish I'd never earned his trust, because the confession he shared with me, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. After that explosive exchange, things between Mr. Thompson and me started to change. He still had his moments of bitterness, but there was a newfound respect in his eyes whenever he looked at me. I began to see him differently too, not just as a grumpy old man, but as someone with layers of complexity hidden beneath his rough exterior. Our interactions became almost ritualistic. Every day, I'd stop by his room under the pretense of checking his vitals or bringing him his medication, and he'd greet me with a new insult. But there was a playful tone to his voice, and I could see the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning, sunshine," I'd say, walking into his room with a cheerful smile. "Sunshine?" he'd grumble. "More like a dark cloud blocking my view." "Well, someone's in a good mood today," I'd retort, checking his blood pressure. "Good mood? I'd have to have a mood to begin with. You're just a constant annoyance." But despite his words, there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I started to see the man behind the mask, and I found myself wanting to know more about him. Who was he before he ended up at the Willowbrook? What experiences had shaped him into the person he was today? As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice subtle changes in Mr. Thompson. He seemed more tired than usual, his once sharp wit dulled by something I couldn't quite identify. At first I chalked it up to old age and the inevitable decline that comes with it. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up whenever I was alone with him. One evening, as I was making my rounds, I found him sitting in his recliner, staring out the window with a faraway look in his eyes. He didn't acknowledge my presence as I entered the room, which was unusual for him. The silence felt heavy, oppressive even. "Mr. Thompson?" I said softly, approaching him with caution. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond right away, and for a moment, I thought he might have fallen asleep with his eyes open. But then he turned to look at me, and I saw a depth of sadness in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you. There's something I need to tell you, before it's too late." The way he said those words sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard confessions before, it was part of the job, but something about his tone, the look in his eyes, told me this was different. This wasn't going to be a story about a long-ago affair or stolen money. No, this was something much darker. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," I said, pulling up a chair beside him. "I'm here for you. What do you need to tell me?" He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the arms of his recliner. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, making him look older, more haunted than ever before. Outside his window, the sky had turned a deep purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. "Emily," he began, his voice shaking, "I haven't always been the man you see before you. I've done things, terrible things that have haunted me for most of my life. And now, as I feel my time growing short, I need to unburden myself. I need someone to know the truth." As he spoke those words, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. A cold draft whispered through the room, though all the windows were closed. And as I sat there, waiting for him to continue, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something ancient and hungry, drawn to the darkness in Mr. Thompson's past. I had no idea then that what I was about to hear would change my life forever, that the horrors Mr. Thompson was about to reveal would haunt my dreams for years to come. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to learn something I could never unlearn. The room seemed to grow colder as Mr. Thompson gathered his thoughts, as if the very air was anticipating the dark tale he was about to share. He took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the darkening sky outside his window. "I was born in a small town," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Life was hard, but it was all I knew. My mother worked herself to the bone to provide for us, and I started working as soon as I was old enough to hold a job." He paused, his hands trembling slightly on the arms of his recliner. "My stepfather. He was a cruel man, especially when he'd been drinking. He'd beat my mother, and when I got older, he started beating me too. I took it because I thought it was my duty to protect her. But one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out and placed my hand over his, offering what little comfort I could. He looked down at our hands, a sad smile playing on his lips. "There was an old well on the outskirts of town," he continued, his voice growing distant. "One night, after a particularly bad beating, I followed him there. I pushed him in. I didn't think, I just wanted it to stop. I wanted him to go away, and he did. He fell, and he never came back up. I tried to hide my shock, but a small gasp escaped my lips." Mr. Thompson looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I know it was wrong," he said, "but I was just a kid, and I didn't know what else to do. I thought it would be over, that we could finally live in peace, but it was only the beginning." He turned back to the window, and I swear I saw something move in the darkness outside. Just a flicker of movement, like a shadow passing behind frosted glass. Mr. Thompson must have seen it too, because his grip on the chair tightened until his knuckles turned white. "There were others," he whispered. "Other people who wronged me, who hurt me or those I cared about. And I made them go away too. I pushed them into that well, and I listened to their screams echoing up from the darkness. The well, it was hungry, always hungry." As he spoke, I noticed the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, gathering in the corners like pools of ink. The temperature had dropped so low I could see my breath misting in the air. "Mr. Thompson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, Why are you telling me this now? He turned to look at me, and the depth of sadness in his eyes made my heart ache. Because I'm tired, Emily. I'm tired of carrying this burden, of living with the guilt of what I've done. And because it's coming for me. What's coming for you? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Look, he whispered, nodding toward the window. I turned to look, and that's when I saw it. A mass of writhing shadows pressed against the glass, darker than the night sky behind it. Within its depths, I could make out faces, dozens of them, their features twisted in eternal agony. Each face was different, but they all shared the same haunted, hollow eyes. They've been waiting, Mr. Thompson said, his voice eerily calm. All these years, they've been waiting. And now it's time. I wanted to run, to flee from that room and never look back. But something held me in place, whether it was duty, curiosity, or sheer terror, I couldn't say. But this isn't the whole story, is it? I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Mr. Thompson shook his head slowly. No, Emily, this is just the beginning. There's so much more, so much worse, and you need to hear it all, because soon, very soon, I won't be able to tell anyone anymore. As if in response to his words, the shadow creature at the window seemed to pulse, its many faces silently screaming. And as I sat there, trying to process what I was seeing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now part of something much bigger and much darker than I could possibly imagine. The true horror of Mr. Thompson's confession was yet to come. And somehow I knew that once I heard it, my life would never be the same. The night seemed to grow heavier as Mr. Thompson prepared to continue his confession. The creature at the window remained, its mass of tortured faces pressing against the glass, watching us with hollow eyes. Each face was distinct, men, women, young, old, all trapped in eternal agony. After my stepfather disappeared, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice growing distant, life got better, at least for a while. My mother and I were finally free from his abuse. But the well was always there, calling to me. I couldn't escape the sound of those screams echoing up from its depths, no matter how hard I tried. His hands trembled in his lap, and despite my fear, I found myself reaching out to steady them. He looked down at our joined hands with a sad smile. There was a group of boys in town, he said, his voice barely audible. They were older than me, bigger. They used to torment me, beat me up, take what little money I had. I thought if I could just get rid of their leader, the others would leave me alone. But it didn't work that way. The shadow creature seemed to pulse with anticipation, its many faces contorting as Mr. Thompson spoke. The temperature in the room had dropped so low that frost was beginning to form on the window panes. I lured them to the well one by one, he continued. Each time I told myself it would be the last. But the well, it was hungry, always hungry, and with each victim, it became easier. The guilt faded, replaced by a sort of satisfaction. I was cleaning up the town, you see, removing the people who made life hell for others. I wanted to pull away, to run from the room and never look back, but something held me in place. Perhaps it was the hypnotic quality of his voice, or maybe the creature's presence had somehow trapped us both in this moment. But then, he said, his voice breaking, something happened that I never expected. My mother, she started asking questions. About the disappearances, about where I went at night. She found things, evidence I thought I'd destroyed. And one night, I caught her walking toward the well. The creature pressed closer to the window, its mass seeming to grow larger, darker. The faces within it began to shift and change, and I swore I could see a woman's face among them, older, kind-looking, with features similar to Mr. Thompson's. You didn't, I whispered, though I already knew the answer. She was going to tell, he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. She was going to expose everything. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't go to jail, so He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The woman's face and the creature's mass seemed to move to the front, her expression a mixture of sorrow and accusation. Mr. Thompson couldn't look at it, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on his lap. After that, something changed, he continued. The well's hunger became insatiable. It wasn't enough to just feed it the guilty anymore. It wanted more. Always more. And God help me, I gave it what it wanted. A low, rumbling sound filled the room. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan, emanating from the creature at the window. The faces within it began to move more frantically, their silent screams becoming almost palpable. But that's not even the worst of it, Mr. Thompson said, his voice dropping even lower. There's more. So much more. And you need to hear it all, Emily, because it's not just my story anymore. It's become something else, something bigger. And now it's coming to collect. The creature pulsed again, and this time I swore I could hear whispers, countless voices speaking in languages I didn't understand, all overlapping into a terrible chorus. The frost on the windows had begun to form patterns, not random crystalline shapes, but symbols, ancient and somehow wrong. What do you mean? I asked, my voice shaking. What's coming to collect? Mr. Thompson finally looked up, meeting my eyes with an expression of pure despair. The debt, Emily. The debt that's been growing for all these years. You see, the well, it wasn't just a well. It was a door, and every soul I fed it, they were payments. Payments toward something I didn't understand until it was too late. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the room began to move independently of any light source. I could feel something building, a pressure in the air, a sense of anticipation that made every nerve in my body scream with the urge to flee. But I stayed. God help me. I stayed. Because I knew that what Mr. Thompson was about to reveal would change everything. Not just about his past, but about the very nature of reality itself. And as the creature continued its silent vigil at the window, I prepared myself to hear the darkest chapter of Mr. Thompson's confession. The truth about what really lay at the bottom of that well, and the price he would ultimately have to pay for disturbing it. The creature at the window had grown larger now, its mass of tortured faces pressing against the glass with increasing urgency. The frost patterns on the window had spread, forming intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with a sickly light. Mr. Thompson watched them with a mix of resignation and fear. The well, he continued, his voice barely audible above the whispers that filled the room, it wasn't just taking the souls I gave it, it was changing them, combining them, creating something new, something hungry. As if in response to his words, the creature shifted, and I could see how the faces within it weren't just pressed together, they were melded, flowing into one another in impossible ways. Some had multiple sets of eyes, others had mouths where they shouldn't be. It was like looking at a living portrait painted by someone who'd lost their mind. I tried to stop, Mr. Thompson said, his hands shaking violently now. After my mother? After what I did to her. I tried to walk away. I met someone, a wonderful woman. We got married, had a daughter. For a while, I thought I could be happy, that I could forget about the well and all the horrible things I'd done. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost make out words now, ancient, terrible words that made my head hurt just trying to understand them. But the well wouldn't let me forget, he continued. The screams started again, not just in my dreams, but when I was awake. I'd see faces in mirrors, in windows, in still water. Their eyes? God, their eyes would follow me everywhere I went. And then, he trailed off, staring at something in the creature's mass. I followed his gaze and saw a new face forming, younger, prettier than the others, with features that looked painfully similar to Mr. Thompson's. Your daughter, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She found my journal, he said, tears streaming down his face. I'd written everything down, you see. Every victim, every detail. I thought it would help ease the guilt. She read it all. And she couldn't live with knowing what her father really was. The face in the creature's mass opened its mouth in a silent scream, and for a moment, all the other faces screamed with it. The sound was beyond anything I'd ever heard. Not just pain or fear, but a fundamental wrongness that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. She took her own life, Mr. Thompson said, his voice breaking. She threw herself into the same well where I'd sent so many others. But the well, it didn't just take her. It used her death to finally create what it had been building all these years. The creature pressed closer to the glass, and I could see now that it wasn't just a collection of faces. There were limbs too, twisted and malformed, all moving with a terrible purpose. The symbols on the frosted window began to glow brighter, their light casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. What do you mean? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. What did it create? A door, he whispered. A permanent door between our world and whatever lies at the bottom of that well. My daughter's death was the final sacrifice it needed, and now, he gestured to the window. Now it's come to collect its architect. The creature's mass surged against the glass, and I heard a distinct cracking sound. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I could see my breath coming in rapid, panicked clouds. Mr. Thompson, I said, rising from my chair. We need to get out of here, we need to. No, Emily, he said, his voice suddenly calm. This is why I told you everything. So you would understand. So you would know why I have to face what's coming. But you need to leave, now, before it's too late. The cracking sound grew louder, and I could see thin lines spreading across the window's surface. The whispers had become a chorus, the symbols on the glass burning so bright they hurt to look at. What about you? I asked, even as I backed toward the door. He smiled, a sad, tired smile that somehow made him look younger. I made my choice long ago, Emily. Every soul I sent into that well was another brick in this doorway, and now it's time to walk through it. The window creaked under the pressure of the creature's mass, thin fractures spreading like spiderwebs across its surface. Mr. Thompson watched them grow with an almost hypnotic fascination, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. There's one more thing you need to know, Emily, he said, his voice barely audible above the creature's whispers. One last secret that makes all the others pale in comparison. I didn't want to hear it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to flee from this room and never look back. But I remained rooted to my chair, trapped in the gravity of his confession. After my daughter died, he continued, after the well took her, I thought I was done. I thought surely this was the end of it. But the hunger. He shuddered. The hunger only grew stronger. The creatures' faces shifted, and I watched in horror as new ones began to form in its writhing mass, dozens of them, each more twisted than the last. They were different from the others somehow, their features less distinct, as if they'd been recycled. I started traveling, Mr. Thompson said, his voice growing distant. Town to town, city to city. Wherever I went, I found another well. Or maybe it was the same well following me. I never could tell. But each one was hungry, and each one needed to be fed. The temperature in the room plummeted further, frost creeping across the floor in intricate patterns that matched the symbols on the window. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost make out words now, names perhaps, or prayers spoken in reverse. How many? I whispered, though I dreaded the answer. I lost count, he said, and for the first time I heard something like pride in his voice. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Some were bad people, yes, abusers, criminals, those who deserved their fate. But others? He trailed off, staring at the creature's mass. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The well didn't care. It never cared. It just wanted more. The creature pulsed, and I realized with growing horror that the faces within it were changing, cycling through different features like a grotesque slideshow. Each face lingered just long enough to register its agony before melting into the next. But that's not the worst part, Mr. Thompson said, turning to look at me with eyes that suddenly seemed much too dark, much too deep. The worst part is what the well promised me in return. Promised you? Immortality, he whispered, and his smile revealed teeth that looked sharper than they should be. Every soul I fed it extended my life, kept me young. Why do you think I'm here, Emily? In this care home? I'm not sick, I'm not dying, I'm hiding. The window cracked louder, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. The creature's mass surged forward, and I could see now that what I'd thought were limbs were actually tentacles, each one tipped with a human hand. Hiding from what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. From them, he said, gesturing to the window. From all of them. They've been hunting me, you see, all these years, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment. And now, he laughed, a hollow sound that made my skin crawl. Now they're finally strong enough to take what's theirs. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and I could feel something building in the air, a pressure, like the moment before a lightning strike. Mr. Thompson closed his eyes, his expression almost peaceful. Run, Emily, he said softly. Run now, while you still can, because what's about to happen, what they're about to do to me, it's not something any living soul should witness. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached for the handle, I heard the window shatter behind me, followed by a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. The sound of thousands of voices crying out in unison, finally free to claim their vengeance. I ran. Through the darkened hallways of Willowbrook, past closed doors and silent rooms, I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled. Behind me, I could hear something. Not footsteps, exactly, but a sound like wet flesh dragging across linoleum, accompanied by that terrible chorus of whispers. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless sleep and haunting dreams. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud. When morning finally came, I felt more exhausted than I had the night before, my mind still racing with the chilling confession Mr. Thompson had shared. As I made my way back to Willowbrook, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the quiet streets. The care home was still mostly asleep, the halls silent save for the distant hum of morning routines beginning to stir. I headed straight for Mr. Thompson's room, my heart pounding in my chest with each step. But as I approached his door, I knew that something was wrong. The air was thick with an ominous silence, a sense of foreboding that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I paused outside his door, taking a deep breath to steady myself before knocking softly. There was no answer, so I pushed the door open gently, peering inside. The room was empty, the window wide open, and the curtains billowing in the breeze. Mr. Thompson was gone, and in his place was a sense of emptiness that seemed to echo through the room like a silent scream. I stood there for a moment, frozen in shock and disbelief, before turning and fleeing from the room, the chilling confession of Mr. Thompson ringing in my ears like a haunting melody. As I made my way back to the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, its eyes burning into the back of my neck like a brand. And as I sat down to chart Mr. Thompson's vitals, I knew, deep down, that the horrors that awaited me were far worse than anything I could have imagined. For in the end, the true darkness lay not in the creature that had haunted Mr. Thompson all these years, but in the chilling secret that he had carried to his grave, a secret that would haunt me for the rest of my days.